Hello, this is Eric de Carbonnel from MarketSkeptics.com. This video is about something I've been afraid to blog about, the Treasury Department's Exchange Stabilisation Fund and its history. The ESF is a super-secret treasury operation and is the official channel for the Treasury's gold and foreign currency dealings. This means covert operations. The ESF is also virtually free of congressional control and has been used to pay a number of strange activities. It is the largest, most powerful financial agency in the world. Trust me, this won't be boring. Let's begin by reviewing the basics. First, the Exchange Stabilisation Fund has been around a long while. It was created by the Gold Reserve Act of 1934 to protect the value of the dollar, and it does this by buying and selling foreign currency. For example, when the US buys $1 billion in March intervention, it is the work of the Treasury's ESF. So the outcome of the inflation versus deflation debate that's been raging over the last few years really depends on this agency that most people have never even heard of. Number 2. ESF operations are conducted through the New York Fed. This means that the New York Fed executes the actual trading, handles the back office documentation, etc. on the ESF's behalf. Basically, the ESF operates from within and controls the New York Fed. Let me give you an example to illustrate this important point. Here's a Wall Street Journal article from 1962. It shows how the New York Fed has been striving to stabilize the dollar as agent for the Exchange Stabilisation Fund. In other words, a large part of the New York Fed staff work for the ESF defending the dollar. The New York Fed essentially is the ESF. So when the New York Fed lends $85 billion to AIG, and when New York Fed staff lament the inability to keep Congress in the dark about the details of that bailout, that is the ESF at work. Number 3. The Treasury's ESF controls international finance. What most people don't realize is that the Secretary of the Treasury is the chief international monetary policy official of the United States, and the ESF helps carry out these responsibilities. What this means is the Fed takes directions from the Treasury Department on international monetary affairs. So in the international arena, the Fed's independence is limited. The Treasury controls international finance, and the Fed does what it's told to do. Chairman Martin, the Fed's longest-serving chairman, confirms that anything done by the Federal Reserve must be coordinated with the Treasury through the Stabilization Fund. The absolutely key point here is that on any international matter, like establishing currency swaps with foreign central banks, bailing out international companies like AIG, and interventions in the currency market, the Treasury is in charge. To understand how important this is, think back to 2008 when McCain enjoyed a 5-point lead over Obama in the polls, and then the New York Fed let Lehman Brothers fail, which almost took down the entire financial system. The market crashed, and overnight the national dialogue turned almost entirely onto the economy. Obama's polling jumped, McCain dropped and never recovered. After the collapse in the fall of 2008, there was nothing the McCain campaign could do to win that election. The ESF's decision to let Lehman Brothers fail gave Obama the presidency. Number 4. The ESF keeps a low profile, using the Fed as a front. It's not an accident that most people have never heard of the Exchange Stabilisation Fund. The ESF is a slush fund that likes to operate in extreme secrecy. The ESF keeps a low profile by letting the Fed speak on its behalf and using the New York Fed to act on its behalf. The ESF also uses the phrase U.S. monetary authorities to keep its name out of the news. Of course, U.S. monetary authorities means the Federal Reserve and the ESF. So what happens is the Federal Reserve ends up with all the credit and the blame, and the ESF continues operating without anyone knowing it exists. One of the many reasons the ESF keeps a low profile is the fact that it's done a terrible job. Since the ESF was put in charge of defending the dollar's value, the greenback has been on a one-way track to worthlessness. Notice that for the period of time that the Federal Reserve was in charge of defending the dollar, it did its job. The dollar kept its value right up to the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, when all the Fed's powers were transferred to the Treasury's ESF. Hijacking the Fed. To understand how the Treasury took control of the Federal Reserve, we need to look at the congressional hearings held in 1934. The Gold Reserve Act was the most important bill to come before Congress since the Civil War. Because it destroyed America's central bank. It fundamentally shifted responsibility from the Federal Reserve System to the Treasury in the only matters in which the control of the currency and credit really matter. Even before this bill, the Secretary of the Treasury was practically dominating the Fed. The Gold Reserve Act gave the Treasury the means to completely control the Federal Reserve. It gave the Secretary of the Treasury such powers of a permanent nature that he could nullify anything the Federal Reserve did. It nullified, if not scrapped, the Federal Reserve System. If you take away all the Fed's powers and gold, where will the Federal Reserve System stand? It utterly emasculated the fundamental idea of the Federal Reserve banking system. These quotes are not exaggerated. Here's a graph of short-term interest rates over the last 50 years. Now, the Federal Reserve supposedly sets short-term interest rates, right? Well, I've color-coded this graph with all the Secretary of the Treasuries for this time period, and it produces some interesting patterns. Notice how visibly the changes in Secretary of the Treasury affect interest rates, especially the trend in interest rates. Up, down, steady, down, up, steady, up, down, up, down. The Fed's independence is a myth. The Treasury has dominated the Federal Reserve through the ESF. Today, the Federal Reserve is a mere shadow of itself, a mechanism functioning as a clearing agency which has no control over anything important. Taking control of America's gold. Even the question of where the ESF got all its money is embarrassing. After confiscating all the gold in America, the Treasury devalued the dollar, creating a huge capital gain. This profit became the war chest of the Treasury, the Exchange Stabilisation Fund. This visual history of the Fed shows how gold holdings were forbidden, then gold was revalued, and the profits put into the Exchange Stabilisation Fund. A key point here is that the Treasury's ESF, through confiscation, took control of 3/4 of the world's monetary gold. The ESF was a guaranteed disaster, and people knew it back in 1934. Transferring all this power to a Secretary of the Treasury who has never had any banking experience, and giving the biggest borrower in the world the ability to inflate its debts away, is not smart. If this bill goes through this way, not even the President can control the ensuing inflation. If the Stabilization Fund should fail, we might be drifting towards a period of extreme inflation. While putting the Treasury in control of monetary policy was bad enough, even worse was the way the ESF was set up. Dictatorial power and no oversight. Section 10 of the Gold Reserve Act states that the sum of $2 billion will be deposited in the ESF under the exclusive control of the Secretary of the Treasury, whose decisions shall be final and not subject to review by any other officer of the United States. Handing that much money to one man is something that should have kept people up at night. The man does not live, never has lived, and never will live, who has the ability to single-handedly manage so large a fund. Furthermore, there was no limit to what the Secretary of the Treasury could do with that money. The bill's wording gave the Treasury unlimited authority to deal in almost anything. Worse still, because the ESF was conceived to operate in secret, Congress decided to never look at what it was doing. Since its creation in 1934, the ESF has operated with no congressional oversight whatsoever. Secrecy about what the government does with people's money is never healthy. The Gold Reserve Act centered in the hands of the Secretary of the Treasury dictatorial powers, far too much power to place in the hands of one man. And, as my great-grandfather Frank Vanderlip states, the Secretary of the Treasury would have a lot of things to do, and power to do them that a banker would not. The ESF begins financing covert operations. It didn't take long for the Treasury to abuse the ESF. In 1940, the Treasury started calling the Stabilization Fund its secret weapon, and the ESF began advancing large sums of money to China, Argentina, and other countries. These loans had nothing to do with stabilization. China needed help holding Japan back, and the handiest place to get the money was the Stabilization Fund. The ESF became America's secret weapon against the Axis during World War II. Not everyone was happy with this development. Most congressmen naively thought that the ESF would defend the dollar, and they were upset. Not that this mattered. The Secretary of the Treasury is under no obligations to comply with the general laws of the United States in handling the Stabilization Fund. Because of this, the ESF has been a source of funds for discretionary executive branch spending, the likes of which Congress has sought to prevent, the Iran-Contra scheme being a recent example. The ESF has a long history of credit operations, and the tables accessible on the Treasury's website give a history of ESF credit arrangements. As you can see, the ESF has been funding covert operations around the world for nearly 80 years. Notice that the 1941 loan to China is not used. In fact, nearly all the ESF's credit arrangements are not used. That's because the $50 million loan to China was closed in the complicated terms of international finance, and the United States lent nothing as far as the Stabilization Fund is concerned. And the $50 million loan to Argentina isn't even in the list. So what type of covert operations was the stabilization financing? Well, the man managing the operations of the ESF during World War II was Harry Dexter White. White wasn't a normal Treasury employee. He was given large authority in vast and sensitive government areas. White was the official Treasury representative on all kinds of committees. This list shows White's widespread governmental activities outside of the Treasury while he was managing the ESF. Of special note is the OSS Advisory Committee. The famous Office of Strategic Services was the counter-espionage and counter-propaganda agency of the government. It was America's first intelligence agency, a vast and chaotic organization of more than 12,000 people. The OSS carried out espionage and put out black propaganda. Now, black propaganda is nasty stuff, and the OSS concocted some of the blackest propaganda you ever heard, all financed by the Treasury's Stabilization Fund. The ESF designs the world's monetary system. Virtually no one is aware that the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Monetary System are ESF creations. Beginning in 1942, the Treasury began playing around with the idea of setting up an International Monetary Stabilization Fund, and by 1943 it had devised a World Currency Stabilization Program. The Treasury's post-war money plan had two parts. The first part was a $10 billion United Nations Bank for Reconstruction and Development, in other words, the World Bank. The second part was an $8 billion International Stabilization Fund, which people now know as the IMF. The author of both proposals was Harry White, whose plan for the post-war international monetary system was endorsed by the 42 countries attending the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. And with the Bretton Woods Agreement signed, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were created. Now, the Harry White who designed the final version of the IMF and World Bank was the same Harry White that was on the OSS Advisory Committee and managed the operations of the ESF. The point here is that White wasn't a banker, an economist, or a monetary expert. He was an ESF spook. His area of expertise was slush funds and financing covert operations. This was not the person you wanted to design the international monetary system. The Bretton Woods system, which made the dollar into the world's reserve currency, was shaped by the Exchange Stabilisation Fund. You see, during World War II, White worked on plans for an inter-American bank, the aim of which was to frustrate Nazi penetration of Latin America. In other words, a slush fund, like the ESF, to finance covert operations. The plans for an inter-American bank did not materialize. However, they inspired the creation of the IMF and World Bank. White designed the IMF to operate along ESF lines. The ESF's own money was then transferred to the IMF, to which other countries made their own contributions. Finally, White took control of this giant pile of money by becoming the first head of the IMF. The ESF, through White, created a giant stabilization fund in its own image. The Bretton Woods IMF and World Bank were a camouflage method of lending billions of American dollars abroad. It was called foreign aid, although in some cases the countries involved didn't even know they were receiving any aid. Using these devices for draining savings out of the US, the ESF went wild financing CIA Cold War activities. And the one coordinating all these IMF and World Bank loans was the ESF. The ESF finances covert operations and then gets repaid from the IMF or the World Bank. Like the Gold Reserve Act, Bretton Woods was a guaranteed disaster, which was fiercely opposed by anyone with any banking experience. bankers had fundamental objections to the Bretton Woods proposals, including their fears about what might happen to the dollar. American bankers were so critical of the Bretton Woods plan that the Treasury had to launch a propaganda campaign to get the agreement signed, and our international banking system was created without the input from real bankers. Donations welcome. For this particular video, I've actually purchased quite a few old papers and articles. This video has also taken months of my time to prepare, so any donations would be appreciated. Running the black budget, as is explained in Operation Rollback. The heart and soul of covert operations is the provision of unvouchered funds and the inviolability of such funds from outside inspection. In other words, untraceable, unaccountable cash. The ESF, with its extravagant freedom from scrutiny enshrined in law, was nothing short of ideal for funding secret operations. That's why, after World War II, when U.S. covert operations were transferred to the Office of Policy Coordination, the new head of the OPC, Frank Wisner, turned to the ESF for financing. Wisner's first plan of action to defeat the Communists in the April 1948 Italian elections was funded by $10 million provided by the ESF. The millions were delivered to Italian politicians in suitcases filled with cash. So it was a slush fund established to stabilize the dollar that started the United States on the first covert operations of the Cold War. It is important to understand here that the ESF runs the US's black budget. The ESF takes in cash from a variety of sources and then funnels that money to covert operations. Here's an example. In 1941, the War Powers Act authorized the U.S. Treasury's Exchange Stabilisation Fund to serve as a holding pool for captured Nazi valuables. This pool of money became a secret source of financing for U.S. clandestine operations in the early days of the CIA. And that's how the ESF runs the black budget. Sources of ESF cash include the gold confiscated from U.S. citizens, IMF and World Bank loans, money siphoned from the Marshall Plan, appropriations buried in the budgets of other agencies, and income from illicit activities like drug trafficking. All U.S. intelligence agencies have been financed by this cash. The ESF is involved in everything the CIA does. More importantly, the ESF is capable of running its own covert operations. After all, the ESF has the unreviewable authority to engage in covert actions in international finance, and has been funding covert efforts since before the CIA's existence. Consider this: the CIA operates under some legal restrictions. There are no legal restrictions on the ESF. The CIA has been investigated by Congress multiple times. The ESF has never been investigated by Congress. It should be obvious that the nastiest stuff will be done by the ESF itself, and that America's darkest secrets are buried where Congress never looks and never asks questions. Most scandals start small, and the perpetrators dig themselves deeper and deeper. The ESF had no hope of ever replacing the enormous quantity of money it had spent. But instead of facing this harsh reality, it tried to delay the day of reckoning. The ESF's desperate dollar defense. The steady drain on U.S. gold holdings was a threat to the ESF, because if it led to dollar devaluation and economic depression, the entire world would have focused on the confidential accounts of the Exchange Stabilisation Fund and the activity it was financing. This also meant defending the Bretton Woods Agreement, because any major reform of the Bretton Woods system, especially the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, would have also exposed the ESF's activities. The ESF needed to do whatever it took to defend the world's monetary system, and the American dollar had to be propped up, even at the cost of begging. This is how the dollar's defense began. Currency interventions to prop up the dollar. In 1961, the ESF began intervening in the foreign exchange market. However, there were some problems. By 1962, the ESF had committed much of its resources through the provision of foreign aid, wasting them funding covert operations. The IMF was also drained of most of its gold and dollars. Remember that the ESF's desperate dollar defense is to hide this fact to begin with. Anyhow, the Federal Reserve System's resources were quickly recruited to supplement the dollar's defense, and the Fed gave up whatever was left of its independence without much of a fight. Unfortunately for the ESF, it had another problem. problem. The way central banks defend their currencies is by selling off their foreign reserves, and ESF did not have any foreign currencies on hand, so the Treasury used a variety of strategies to come up with the foreign currencies it needed. It got West Germany to prepay its World War II debt. The Treasury also borrowed to get the money it needed, using a series of special Treasury bond sales to foreign governments. These were called Rosa bonds. They were denominated in foreign currencies and were part of America's national debt. The ESF also entered into a network of swap agreements with other central banks. Currency swaps are a derivative instrument that allow irresponsible central banks to temporarily prop up their currencies by racking up large amounts of foreign debt. The ESF used these swaps because they hid what it was doing. For example, it doesn't look like the US is borrowing anything here, does it? Still another way the ESF got foreign currencies was by using the IMF. The IMF was a great help in defending the dollar. However, explaining how these IMF loans work is complicated, but it adds up to this: more foreign-denominated debt hidden from the American people. Through all these different types of arrangements, the United States armed itself with the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of major foreign currencies it needed to defend the dollar. Gambling in derivative markets. Because so much of its resources were tied up, the ESF intervened mainly in the forwards market. Despite all its stratagems to come up with foreign currencies, the Treasury simply didn't have enough to defend the dollar, so it sold foreign currencies it didn't yet have through forward transactions. By promising to sell these currencies in the future, the Treasury encouraged individuals to hold dollar-denominated assets. When the dollar for future delivery sells at a substantial discount, it implies that holders have doubts about its value, and weakness in the dollar may induce foreigners to move their money elsewhere. So every time a foreign currency traded at a premium to the dollar, the ESF entered into millions worth of forward contracts. All these forward commitments carried the risk of loss if the dollar did not appreciate. For example, when the Treasury was selling all these forward marks, it was gambling that the price of the mark would drift lower, and the ESF eventually lost big time on its forward bets. Forwards are also a type of derivative, the same complicated financial bets that have fueled the mess over the last few years. And 50 years ago, long before Wall Street even knew what they were, the ESF was dealing in massive quantities of these risky bets. The London Gold Pool. Another arrangement made to bolster the world's monetary system against collapse was the London Gold Pool. Formed in late 1961, it was a device to halt the raids on gold and give the dollar the appearance of strength. The Exchange Stabilisation Fund was used to participate in the gold pool, and the US supplied 59% of the gold sold in London. The United States never officially acknowledged taking part in this pool. However, this very real international gold pool kept the London free market stable temporarily during the 60s, so the ESF has a history of international conspiracy, deceiving the world. This Wall Street Journal article shows the ESF's attitude towards the truth. In this business, you have to choose between lying to people or scaring them to death. The ESF's choice is clear: to lie. This lying is squarely in the public interest. To give the world a glimpse at the raw figures for a single day's actual gold outflow could prove disastrous. Debasing statistics. The ESF is ever more shrewdly guarding the dollar's value abroad through little-known techniques that range from double-counting gold bars to tinkering with the maturities of otherwise routine government securities. The result is a web of statistics that mask almost as much as they display. Even a prominent financier who helped create the government's dollar defenses confesses that he can't tell anymore what our balance of payment trend is. The ESF had arrangements with the IMF that made the gold stock look healthier than it really was. Only a fleeting footnote brought the ESF's double counting of gold bars to light. For ESF officials anxious to put the best face on figures, nothing is too absurd, including selling government debt with the odd maturity of 1 year and 2 days. This dishonesty was centered in the Treasury at the ESF. Even the massive currency swaps the Fed has with other central banks are carefully constructed to avoid statistical injuries. Since the 1960s, the dodges have only become more artful.
What if it's true, as Kevin Phillips recently stated in an article in Harper's, that ever since the 1960s, Washington has gulled its citizens and creditors by debasing official statistics, the vital instruments with which the vigor and muscle of the American economy are measured?
Propaganda. Statistical nonsense was only the beginning. In defense of the dollar, the ESF unleashed the mighty Wurlitzer. Every propaganda pitch was used to promote confidence in the dollar. Whenever the value of the dollar came under question, this propaganda took over to convince us that losing money is good for us. It was in the 60s that the ESF's favorite bit of propaganda was born: the danger of deflation. Americans were told to worry less about the outflow of US gold and instead worry about worldwide deflation. This was pure ESF propaganda. Deflation signifies a general decline in prices, and it hasn't happened in the United States since the ESF's creation. So right when the ESF was in the middle of this desperate dollar defense, there was a flood of articles like these, warning that the dollar might magically go up in value. Two things have happened since the 1960s. The dollar has lost nearly all its value, and the articles warning about deflation have gotten louder and louder in volume. Today we've reached a point where every Wall Street economist is looking for the arrival of a great deflation. Two things to take away from this are: 1. The loudness of the deflation propaganda gives a good idea of the ESF's level of control over US media. 2. As long as the ESF is in charge of defending the dollar, the chance of any real deflation is nil. Corrupting economics. Classic economics teaches that government deficit spending leads to inflation. This was the dominant view before the 1960s. Heavy deficits made for inflation. Heavy government spending ruins the dollar. This fundamental truth was acknowledged by everyone, and it was a threat to the ESF. You see, in the 60s, when the ESF was spreading deflation propaganda and doing everything in its power to boost confidence in the dollar, articles like this one appeared in the press. If we are safe in all this spending, what are we waiting for? Why don't we double the national debt and everyone gets rich? Anyone can promise to speed up the printing presses. Does this bring happiness and security? We all grow progressively poorer as the dollar's value declines, and declining currencies follow the law of physical bodies. They accelerate as they fall. It should be obvious why the US Treasury did not like classic economics. As part of its dollar defense, the ESF used its network of American academics to promote a new set of rules for managing the economy. This new theory of fiscal management called for planned treasury deficits to lead America to prosperity on a permanent basis and make recessions obsolete. It was called Keynesian economics, and the 1960s were a pivotal decade in the shift from classic to Keynesian economics. Of course, this Keynesian economics was nonsense. The reality is that governments that overspend face global and epidemical forces from the outside that no amount of mystic theory can avoid or kick down into the deep freeze. When anybody proposes cradle-to-the-grave disbursements by the US Treasury that somehow sound free, our misinformation becomes complete. The Academy Award-winning 2010 documentary, Inside Job, shows how the study of economics has been completely corrupted.
The financial industry also exerts its influence in a more subtle way, one that most Americans don't know about. It has corrupted the study of economics itself.
Arm-twisting pro-US governments. By 1960, the world was filled with pro-US states as a result of the CIA's actions. Although this was done initially simply to fight the Cold War, the ESF turned to these countries for support in defending the dollar. You see, foreign purchases of US securities weren't left entirely to chance. Foreign governments were coaxed into investing in the dollar in the most statistically smoothing way. In other words, the ESF went back to all the fascists, militarists, and murderers it supported, and through some arm twisting got them to help defend the dollar. These CIA-installed regimes started accumulating more dollars in their official reserves than they actually needed. The Treasury also began to pressure these pro-US states to buy weapons, since purchases of military wares helped to defend the dollar. Take Japan, for example, who was recruited to help save the dollar in 1968. Japan agreed to aid the dollar by purchasing Treasury securities and increasing its purchases of American arms. Since then, Japan's reserves have skyrocketed, and Japan remains one of the top 10 buyers of US weapons. With 70% of all sales, America now runs a global weapons monopoly. Don't think for a second that that's an accident. The IMF and World Bank seek repayment on their phony loans. The 1960s also witnessed another type of revolution, the empowerment of the World Bank and the IMF. If you remember, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were created by the ESF to help finance covert operations. Under the cover of foreign aid, they made billions of, quote, loans to fund CIA activities. Well, in the 60s, the ESF started trying to collect on all these phony loans. This is outlined in the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. The ESF used highly paid professionals who cheated countries around the world to get the loans repaid. These economic hitmen used draconian techniques to get the IMF and World Bank their money back. Their tools for getting their way were even nastier, and when these economic hitmen failed to get leaders to comply,
the jackals go in and either overthrow or assassinate these leaders, and if the jackals fail, as they did in Iraq, then they'll be sent in the military.
President Kennedy disagrees with the ESF. Although the ESF had an extraordinary amount of power, there was one person that was supposed to be able to control it, the President of the United States. And when the ESF was beginning its desperate dollar defense, the President of the United States was John F. Kennedy. Now, it was no secret that the Treasury and President Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors had been engaged in a running battle over the best way to defend the dollar. The divisions within the American government followed habitual lines. The Treasury Department, specifically Secretary Douglas Dillon and Undersecretary Robert V. Rosa, advocated rather limited changes in international financial arrangements. It is no surprise that the Treasury resisted monetary reform. You'd expect the guy selling Rosa bonds to reject the idea of scrapping the existing system. On the other side, you had President Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors, the State Department, and the White House staff, who wanted radical new international mechanism and far greater multilateral currency management. That would have been the end of Bretton Woods and the ESF-controlled monetary system. For the first 2.5 years of Kennedy's presidency, the view of the Treasury prevailed. But in the middle of 1963, JFK stopped listening to the Treasury. President Kennedy swung more closely to the views held by his Council of Economic Advisors. Monetary reform was winning support. Then in August 1963, JFK came publicly to accept the idea that the United States had to join in the creation of a new international financial machinery. This was a radical change. 2 months later, in October, the President won a standing ovation for declaring that the United States will support any needed measures to increase international liquidity. Widespread support seemed to be developing for an overhaul of the world's currency system, and President Kennedy was about to expose the ESF's secrets to the world, sending important people at the Treasury to jail, the same people who, through the Secret Service, were in charge of defending his life. 1 month later, President Kennedy died, killed by a magic bullet. And when JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, ran for president, he died. Even JFK's son also died. The Kennedy curse. There was one good thing stemming from the death of President Kennedy, and that's the fact that monetary reform died with him. Ambitious plans to remake the world's monetary system never got off the ground. This disappointed the State Department, the Council of Economic Advisors, and a large number of academic economists. And it was a triumph for Robert Rosa, the manager of the Treasury's ESF. Things spiral out of the ESF's control. Although the threat of monetary reform was gone, the ESF, in trying to defend the dollar, was essentially running a giant Ponzi scheme that was doomed to failure. The steady drop in US gold defied all attempts to plug the drain, and by 1967 the United States was at the brink of a fiscal crisis. The London gold pool failed in 1968 in the face of the largest gold rush in history. Buyers throughout Europe demanded gold, and mob scenes erupted as the price soared. Many refused to accept US dollars as payment. Gold stocks were cleaned out virtually overnight. The trading in gold was colossal. The rush was on because speculators had become convinced that the US was nearing the end of its gold tether. Having tasted blood and scenting the kill, they ripped and clawed the remaining gold stocks from the gold pool. The whole international monetary system was collapsing, with the Treasury controlling its actions. Confidence in the Fed collapsed. The Fed became a joke. The Federal Reserve hurls thunderbolts and nothing happens. It tells the world solemnly that, by golly, it means business in stopping inflation, but it doesn't know how. U.S. deficits spiraled out of control, and the more money these deficits created, the more severe the inflation. The law of supply and demand made this inevitable. Declining currencies accelerate as they fall, and the dollar was crashing against gold. and consumer prices were soaring parabolically. The ESF's Rosa bonds and forward transactions created losses as the dollar depreciated. The ESF soon registered a negative capital position. It was technically bankrupt. A sense of fear of the unknown was being transmitted by the normally cool operators of the New York Fed. Not only was the dollar falling against stronger currencies, but also weaker ones. There was a sense of panic. In newspapers, the Treasury was being openly ridiculed. Then, in 1979, the dollar lost its biggest support. The European community was determined to avoid further inflation. And so the Treasury was told that support from Europe was gone. The vulnerability of the dollar was impossible to describe. Congress was warned that America was about to experience a holocaust of runaway inflation, a cataclysm which would make the Depression seem like a tea party. Then deficits stopped mattering. In 1981, caught in a tide of red ink, administration officials tried, somewhat implausibly, to downplay the traditional view that deficits lead to spiraling prices. Stunned audiences were told that there is no direct or indirect connection between deficits and inflation. The U.S. then ran massive deficits, and inflation went down. The link between deficits and inflation broke completely. For the record, this is the equivalent of an African shaman declaring he has mystical powers and then levitating himself in a ring of fire. After deficits stopped mattering, the dollar soared, and the ESF's profits skyrocketed. In 1980, after dumping 100,000 tons of gold onto the market in a desperate attempt to keep prices down, the Treasury halted regular gold sales. Gold prices then entered a 20-year bear market. Remember the variety of stratagems the ESF used to arm itself with foreign currencies by borrowing from abroad? Well, after 1980, this stopped being a problem. The all-knowing, all-seeing Fed did what it had to do to kill inflation, without ever stopping printing money. We were spending our way to prosperity, enjoying the best economy in years, low unemployment, high profits, trivial inflation, all fueled by our willingness to go deeply into debt in the cause of immediate gratification. It was called disinflation, and it was here to stay. Sure, the majority of financial experts had been expecting a wave of inflation, a rerun of the 1970s, only worse. But things didn't work out that way, thanks to the magic of disinflation. As for questions like, why did interest rates enter a 30-year downward trend? Or, how the hell does this disinflation thing work? Well, they remain unanswered. Why deficits stopped mattering. In the 1980s, the link between deficits and inflation was broken, but the money printing never stopped. How did the ESF pull off this magic trick? Well, it is possible to print money without causing inflation. For example, if the government prints billions, and those billions disappeared overseas, there would be no inflation. This is exactly what happened in the 1980s, when a large part of the US currency went missing, disappearing into the hands of foreigners, and the supply of dollars in the US stopped growing, ending inflation. This wasn't an accident, since in 1981, administration officials started telling the entire world that deficits don't matter. They knew that billions of dollars were about to disappear overseas. This leads to two very important questions. Where did these disappearing dollars go, and why did they leave the US? Iran-Contra and the Reagan Doctrine. Finding the missing dollars is not hard. The New York Times reported in 1990 that Nicaragua was using a new currency. Against a background of hyperinflation, all Nicaraguans scrambled to convert their Cordobas into American currency. So why did the Nicaraguan Cordoba collapse in the 1980s? Well, John Stockwell gives us the answer by describing the CIA's bloody campaign to destabilize Nicaragua beginning in 1981, the year deficits stopped mattering. When the US doesn't like a government, they send in the CIA to tear apart the social and economic fabric of the country. In other words, creating terrible conditions. To destabilize Nicaragua, the US began funding this force called the Contras. And the Contras, under U.S. direction, systematically blew up granaries, sawmills, bridges, government offices, schools, and health centers. One example of hard proof of the CIA's involvement in all this is the Sabotage Manual, which was a comic book-style manual that encouraged Nicaraguans to hurl Molotov cocktails and engage in other forms of sabotage. The Contras also systematically assassinated religious workers, teachers, health workers, elected officials, and government administrators. To help with all this, the CIA provided provided an assassination manual to the Contras. It caused quite a stir when it surfaced in 1984. This was all part of Iran-Contra, when the United States armed and trained Honduras-based militants to topple the government of Nicaragua, even after Congress made it illegal. The Contras' form of warfare was one of systematic and bloody human rights abuse, of murder, torture, mutilation, rape, arson, destruction, and kidnapping. The atrocities are well documented, and they were financed through the ESF. America was at war with Nicaragua. Navy ships supervised the mining of harbors, while U.S. planes bombed the capital, and this bloody CIA campaign was part of the Reagan Doctrine, an effort to roll back communist regimes in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Nicaragua was just one of many destabilizations, all of which were bloody, horrifying affairs. These thousands of brutal CIA covert actions, which destabilized a third of the countries in the world, are what saved the dollar in the 1980s. That leaves only the question of how these disappearing dollars traveled from the United States to places like Nicaragua. Dollarizing the world. Dollarization is the process whereby the US dollar supplants a country's national currency as the medium of exchange. Many countries have an enormous quantity of dollars in circulation. Where did these greenbacks come from? Well, the most reasonable explanation is drug money laundering, which brings us to bulk currency smuggling, the primary method for expatriating drug proceeds from the United States. This dollar smuggling takes place through air cargo, outbound freighter, and the same vehicles used to smuggle cocaine in. When you add together the cash smuggled out of America by Mexican, South American, and Canadian drug dealers, you realize that the total bulk currency smuggling is huge. This bulk currency smuggling took off in the 80s as a result of an intensifying crackdown on money laundering by banks who were under threat of heavy fines from federal authorities. This campaign against money laundering explains the huge outflow of dollars to the rest of the world. By tightening currency restrictions, the Treasury forced launderers to resort to bulk currency shipments. These controls on bank accounts and wire transfers have grown ever stricter, forcing more and more cash out of the United States. And all these outgoing laundered greenbacks dollarized the world. In Afghanistan right now, the Afghani and the dollar are pretty much interchangeable. The illicit trade in opium has single-handedly introduced the dollar to the region. Meanwhile, the American coca trade has led to mass addiction and the vicious dollarization of Latin America. In 1986, as a result of Iran-Contra, it came to light that the U.S. government was directly developing massive cartel infrastructure in Central America. Thousands of tons of cocaine were brought into the U.S., and the money was used to introduce the dollar to the entire Latin American region. The US dollar is now the standard currency for El Salvador and Panama, and it is simply the unofficial de facto tender in the rest of the region. That's right, nearly every country in the Americas involved in producing, transporting, and using cocaine is using the US dollar as a medium for exchange. Treasury profits from the war on drugs. The huge inflow of narcotics during the 80s did more than just dollarize the world. It also delivered massive profits to the Treasury and the ESF. The government began confiscating enormous quantities of property and cash, and the proceeds were funneled directly into the U.S. Treasury. This was all part of the government's drug forfeiture program, which was radically expanded in the 80s. This innovative effort gave the U.S. Treasury title to any property used in a drug transaction. Federal law now grants the government extremely wide license in forfeiture cases. We've gotten to the point where virtually anything can be seized if it has substantial connection to drug trafficking. And since the Justice Department has budget targets it must meet, federal undercover agents and informants are schooled in the financial importance of arranging a drug sale on or near valuable real estate so that the entire tract can be seized through the government's forfeiture program. Informants are often rewarded with a percentage of the assets they deliver this way. Thus, the family home is fair game for forfeiture if a relative or friend were to use it unlawfully. For example, the government took away the home of a New Jersey woman under the claim it was purchased with drug profits, but the house was actually bought 3 years before the drug offenses. The forfeiture situation is totally out of control. It has become a dysfunctional policy where efficiency is measured by the amount of money seized rather than the impact on drug trafficking. Narcotics units prefer seizing cash rather than confiscating drugs and reducing the supply reaching the streets. Those dogs you see at the border aren't looking for drugs. They are currency-sniffing dogs. It is important to note that the more drugs come into the US, the more the Treasury profits. Okay, let's look at the next piece of the puzzle, which involves the largest banking scandal you've never heard of. BCCI, the dirtiest bank of them all. Bank fraud cases are usually dry, tedious affairs. Not this one. Nothing in the history of modern financial scandals rivaled the unfolding saga of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Never had a single scandal involve so much money, so many nations, and so many prominent people. It was the largest corporate criminal enterprise ever, the biggest Ponzi scheme, the most pervasive money laundering operation ever created for the likes of Saddam Hussein and Colombian drug barons. BBCI was more than just a criminal bank. It had a clandestine division called the Black Network, which functioned as a global intelligence operation and a mafia-like enforcement squad. BBCI was used to funnel money during Iran-Contra. The bank also bribed public officials around the world and was protected by the Justice Department, which tried to derail any investigation. It was in the early 1980s, when deficits stopped mattering, that the Black Network began running its own drugs, weapons, and currency deals. Senior bankers feared that they would be physically maimed, even killed, if they were found talking about the BBCI's activities. It was a really nasty operation, and an integral part of the ESF's global dollar Ponzi scheme. The HIV equals AIDS fraud, the enormous quantities of heroin and cocaine flooding the United States, quickly led to a deadly drug epidemic. By the mid-80s, the ESF's drug smuggling operation was so successful that kids were buying cocaine with their lunch money. The government's role in sparking this deadly epidemic has been reported on many times. For example, Gary Webb, an investigative reporter who won more than 30 journalism awards, including a Pulitzer Prize, in 1996 wrote a series of stories entitled Dark Alliance. Based on extensive research and backed by a mountain of evidence, Dark Alliance described how the U.S. government was in fact involved in dumping cocaine into California, sparking the most destructive drug epidemic in American history. Now, heroin and cocaine are not healthy things, so if you start distributing tons of them into a country, hundreds of thousands of people will start to die. This is what happened in the 80s, when the ESF's flood of drugs led to a deadly epidemic in the drug-using community. People were dying because their immune systems were breaking down. In 1982, it was clear that this AIDS epidemic was not caused by an infectious disease. There was no evidence that the condition was spreading from person to person, and the general public didn't need to fear an epidemic. The condition did not spread to other family members, hospital workers, or researchers. Unless your life was filled with frequent sex and frequent drug use, you were in absolutely no danger of dying from AIDS. This AIDS epidemic became a threat to the ESF, who was in the process of piping as many tons of drugs into the U.S. as it could. This is because Congress came under enormous pressure to do something because of the hundreds of thousands that were dying. Any crackdown on the true causes of the epidemic, especially drug use, would have been a problem. The ESF fixed the situation by turning to its Wurlitzer and inventing another cause for AIDS, the HIV virus.
We have a long way to go in the fight against HIV. The virus that causes AIDS. 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 The virus that causes AIDS.
Thanks to the HIV equals AIDS fraud, the government handed out free needles instead of cracking down on drug use. To truly understand the facts about AIDS, watch the documentary HIV equals AIDS, Fact or Fraud.
AIDS has failed to spread into the female population also. When the U.S. Army began testing new recruits for HIV in 1984, they discovered an amazing fact. HIV infection was evenly spread between males and females, 50-50, and it's remained that way since then. It should follow that AIDS would be 50% male and 50% female. Yet 9 out of every 10 people who develop AIDS continue to be male. This could explain why drug use is more related to AIDS than HIV infection. In the U.S., males use over 80% of all hard psychoactive drugs. AIDS is caused by recreational drug use, and injected drugs like heroin and cocaine are the direct cause of AIDS in 9 out of 10 cases.
The original papers upon which the HIV equals AIDS myth was based were fabricated, and there aren't 26 million Africans dying of AIDS. That is another myth. The mighty Wurlitzer plays on. The elaborate scheme to save the dollar would not have been possible without the media's cooperation. The ESF's propaganda network allowed it to inject Americans with a synthetic reality, like the HIV equals AIDS myth. But the Wurlitzer did much more than that, as demonstrated by what happened when Dark Alliance was published. The initial reaction to Gary Webb's Dark Alliance was dead silence. In other words, a total media blackout. You see, if the Time publishes an article on BBCI, and the rest of the nation's editors readers decide to ignore the story, it quickly withers and dies like a light-starved plant. Nothing sells like scandal, so when a story like BBCI is ignored, it's unnatural. Anyhow, Dark Alliance got the silence treatment big time. No one would touch it. But no one had counted on the enormous popularity of the website. Information that goes viral on the internet is perhaps the Wurlitzer's only weakness, so Dark Alliance developed a political momentum all on its own, and it happened despite a virtual news blackout from major media. Ultimately, public pressure forced the national newspapers into the fray, and when they spoke in unison. The official conclusion reached by the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times was there's no story here. Dark Alliance was flawed. The way the mainstream press responded to the series was later described as one of the most venomous and factually insane assaults in living memory. Apparently, CNN helps the CIA redefine reality. Despite all the furor, the facts of the story never changed except to become more damning. But the perception of them did, and that's all that really mattered. Once a story becomes discredited, the rest of the media shies away from it, and it becomes consigned to the dustbin of history as an internet conspiracy theory. This is how undesired stories are brutally assaulted and killed. It works pretty damn well, too. You see, the media is free to report on all the sex scandals it wants. But when it comes to the real down and dirty stuff, that's where we see the limits of our freedom. In today's media environment, such stories are not even open for discussion. Gary Webb later died of 2 gunshot wounds to the head. It was ruled a suicide. The superdollar. Although the ESF managed to print money without causing inflation by dollarizing the rest of the world, it still was left with an enormous pool of greenbacks, whose return into the US could collapse the dollar. It needed some way to neutralize this threat and slow the return of these foreign dollars. This brings us to the superdollar, also known as the supernote, another massive, multi-decade, ongoing fraud that no one has heard of. The supernote is a counterfeit $100 bill that looks exactly like the real thing. Here's why the supernote is super. It contains every security feature of the real bill. It is printed on intaglio presses that only governments have access to. It is made with rag cotton paper. It contains tiny red and blue fibers. It has an embedded plastic strip, etc. There have been 19 versions so far. The supernotes are of such high quality and are updated so frequently that they could only be produced by a US government agency such as the ESF. After first being detected in 1989, the superdollar has spread, and soon countries like Russia were filled with high-quality fakes. At first Iran and Syria were blamed, then criminal gangs in Russia or China, finally North Korea. However, this is unlikely. These notes go way beyond what normal counterfeiters are able to do. Also, supernotes appear to have been produced in quantities less than what it would cost to acquire the sophisticated machinery needed to make them. Whoever's doing it is apparently operating at a loss. There's more. Even though the counterfeiters have mastered infrared-sensitive security inks, the notes are produced in such a way that they have little chance of going undetected in America. In other words, the super sophisticated counterfeiters could make absolutely untraceable notes if they wanted to, but they don't. They deliberately produce them in a way that can be tracked by no one except the US government and other central banks. This phony 100 bill is not a fake anymore. It's an illegal parallel print of a genuine note. The supernote serves 2 purposes. 1, it increases ESF profits. 2, it helps to negate the threat posed by dollars in the rest of the world. Not only do superdollars never come back from abroad, they also make foreigners nervous about bringing their real dollars back to the US in case they turn out to be fake. Next, we need to discuss what would happen if the incoming flow of drugs were to dry up. First, the outgoing laundered dollars would be gone, leaving only the incoming dollars from abroad. Second, there would be no more profits from the war on drugs, which would mean a lot more printed money, and this would very quickly lead to problems for the ESF. I mention this because the incoming flow of drugs has been interrupted once before. Breakdown in the flow of heroin. In 1979, when the dollar was collapsing, the ESF's capital position was negative, and all hope for the dollar seemed lost, the CIA began its biggest covert operation ever, by supporting Osama bin Laden and other guerrilla fighters in Afghanistan. An integral part of the CIA's intervention was a huge increase in the production of opium and heroin, which have continued rising ever since. One of the key architects of all this was George W. Bush Sr. Anyhow, the heroin trafficking was handled by BBCI up until its collapse in 1991, after which it was handled by a terrorist organization known as Al-Qaeda, and something went terribly wrong for the ESF Al-Qaeda heroin operation in 2001. You see, in the fall of 2000, the Taliban announced a total ban on the cultivation of opium. Taliban militia then went out and burned heroin labs and drugs. The ban was a success. Of course, the world refused to recognize this good deed. In fact, the US hit Afghanistan with sanctions. Despite this, the betting was the ban was going to hold up. Heroin stocks were going down and they wouldn't be replaced. The Taliban's eradication of poppies was probably the most dramatic event in the history of illegal drug markets. There was no chance that opium from other sources could compensate for the loss, and by June opium had gone up 5 to 7 times in price. Now you remember what happens when the flow of drugs gets interrupted, right? Well, as seen on the Fed's website, things started to get really interesting around the middle of 2001. Now at the beginning of the year everything was normal. The growth of currency was in single digits. But as July came around, that changed. By August, the amount of dollars in circulation was soaring. The increase in currency in circulation from June to August 2001 was the largest in recorded history. Deficits were about to start mattering again. But then, in September 2001, 9/11 happened. One skyscraper collapsed. Then a second skyscraper collapsed. Finally, a third skyscraper, World Trade Center 7, collapsed. No one has really explained why this third skyscraper collapsed. Also unexplained is why molten steel was found weeks after 9/11 at ground zero.
This is how it's been since day one. Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later. It's probably 1,500 degrees.
8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. At one point, I think there were about 2,800 degrees. There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
Finally, no one has explained why scientists around the world are finding nanothermite, a military-grade explosive, in the dust from 9/11. This is a peer-reviewed paper published in a scientific journal for those of you who know what that means. The flow of heroin is restored. September 11 solved the ESF's heroin problem. By October, heroin was flooding into the West. Wholesale prices dropped, and farmers went back to growing poppies. By the next year, opium production was back where it was supposed to be. However, the invasion did more than just restore Afghan poppy production. It took it to a whole new level. Most of this increase came from Helmand province. And guess who controls this Helmand province?
You know, they have these opium fields, and we are tolerating it. We are tolerating the cultivation of the opium. Here you have one of the best fighting forces in the world ever mounted. And in a sense, you're watching as this opium is being grown.
Afghanistan now produces 93% of the world's opium, and it is being grown under the protection of US troops. Predictably, the skyrocketing production has had deadly domestic implications. By 2006, Afghan heroin was potent, cheap, and pouring into the US, causing a surge in heroin-related deaths. And the problem has continued to grow as heroin has roared back to life in America, killing more and more people across the US. Also predictably, Afghanistan got hit by an AIDS epidemic. Although the country used to have negligible rates of AIDS, the US then invaded and turned it into the largest producer of heroin in the world, and now AIDS is killing thousands. The structure of a Ponzi scheme. Ponzi schemes require 2 levels of deception. One aimed at those who aren't aware and you think is wrong, and another aimed at those who know there's fraud. Take Bernard Madoff's auditor, for example, who now faces 114 years in prison. Turns out David Freiling did not know about the Ponzi scheme, and even invested all his family's money with Madoff. Now that's what you call a sucker. There were a large number of people who knew Bernie Madoff was cheating. In fact, the participation of these people was essential for the Ponzi scheme to work. However, no one gets involved with a fraud if they know it's a Ponzi scheme. That's why Bernie Madoff deceived them about what they were involved in, inventing a fake or imaginary fraud. All Ponzi schemes require people tricked into getting involved by these fictitious conspiracy theories, which have several defining characteristics. They are elitist. This is so the participants feel special and don't ask too many awkward questions. They are relatively benign. This is so the suckers don't understand the risks they are taking. They are open-ended, because no one would knowingly work for a Ponzi scheme. They are run by masterminds, whose strange actions are part of some imaginary master plan. Finally, because they aren't real, they are easily disproved, which is incredibly useful in ridiculing those warning of fraud. Since the ESF is running a giant dollar Ponzi scheme, it is not surprising that there are so many conspiracy theories today. Just because there are high-profile journalists who believe they are part of a new world order doesn't make it true. They are fools who know not what they do. The bad banker deception. Whenever someone stumbles upon a massive financial fraud going on, they often start believing that a group of bankers is responsible. According to this conspiracy theory, it all began with the Fed, when several of the world's richest bankers got together on Jekyll Island and conspired to destroy the dollar. One of those bankers, Frank Vanderlip, is my great-grandfather, which is why I know what really happened. The reality is that Frank Vanderlip was not responsible for fiat money. In fact, he campaigned quite hard against it. You see, although the secret Jekyll Island meeting did happen, what is never mentioned is that the Treasury radically redesigned the bill, making the dollar a fiat currency backed by the taxing authority of the government. As bad as Wall Street wanted a central bank, it did not want it bad enough to start the government on its way to the issuance of fiat money. So Frank Vanderlip was not alone in opposing the bill. Virtually all bankers waged an intense campaign against the Federal Reserve Act. They were in a panic. The proposal constituted an unprecedented level of government interference in the most sensitive area of the capitalist economy. The intense opposition of bankers isn't surprising, since there is no case in all of history where a nation has started issuing fiat money that has not resulted in the complete breakdown of the financial system of that country. Frank Vanderlip did manage to revise the most objectionable parts of the bill, helping delay the dollar's destruction. He also was not a pawn in a global conspiracy. When Frank Vanderlip was employed as a journalist, he was a type of crusading newsman that has now disappeared. And after retiring from Citibank, Frank Vanderlip investigated corruption in President Warren Harding's administration. His actions were instrumental in exposing the T-Dome scandal, which, before Watergate, was regarded as the greatest and most sensational scandal in the history of American politics. He did this at huge expense and at some risk to his life. Frank Vanderlip was not the type of man who would be involved in a sinister conspiracy. The bad banker deception has been the Treasury's most useful bit of propaganda. The Federal Reserve Act was passed to take control of the currency away from evil private bankers. Then, in 1934, the ESF was created to give the Treasury the power and the weapon with which to protect itself against privately owned banks. And since then, the Treasury's interference in banking has only grown. Examples of this include creating mortgage securitization, then through the RTC, the subprime market, and the insane models now used by rating agencies. And every crisis has been blamed on bankers. What's so tragic about all this is that the bad banking argument is then used to grab even more power. This is how our financial system has become corrupted. Goldman Sachs used to be an ethical firm that didn't break the law, but then Robert Rubin became Treasury Secretary, and Goldman Sachs became the abomination we know today. The ESF's dollar fraud is falling apart. The Exchange Stabilisation Fund's Ponzi scheme was always doomed to collapse. And right now, the day of reckoning is at hand. The desperation of the financial frauds used to prop up the dollar are evidence of this. As a result of decades of financial insanity, we've gotten to the point where the FDIC is liquidating banks that have no assets left in them whatsoever. To keep the financial system together, the Fed has been selling massive quantities of options. And when interest rates head up, the derivative market will go up in smoke. A food shortage has sent prices soaring, crushing the U.S. consumer sector and leading to riots around the world. U.S.-backed dictators are being overthrown, and the death of Osama bin Laden was not within the ESF's plans. Problems are reaching the level where nothing can hide them. The U.S. economy is dying, and America's infrastructure is crumbling. Poverty rates are soaring. Nearly half of Detroit can't read. There are places in the U.S. that the police no longer respond to 911 calls, and the murder rate in Flint, Michigan is even worse than Baghdad. America is becoming a third world country. To keep things going just a few more months, America's highways, ports, and even parking meters are being auctioned off. The ESF is stripping the last meat off the bone, and there's nothing left. Smart people have seen the writing on the wall and are turning whistleblower. Interestingly, in this category is former chairman Alan Greenspan.
A lot of that stuff was just plain fraud. There was rampant fraud in a lot of what was going on in these markets to get far higher levels of enforcement of fraud statutes. Existing ones, I'm not even talking about new. Things were being done which were certainly illegal and clearly criminal in certain cases.
Really, Greenspan? Only now do you mention that there's rampant, unprosecuted fraud? The amount of people hurt by the ESF's desperate Ponzi scheme defies comprehension. And as the dollar collapses, all the ESF's activities will be revealed to the world. People are not in a forgiving mood when a Ponzi scheme collapses, and there is a hunt for anyone connected to the crime. Ignorance is not an accepted excuse. Those involved in ESF frauds don't have a clue what's ahead for them, and everyone is about to be reminded that there is no such thing as magic. Donations appreciated. It has taken an enormous amount of time and effort to make these 5 videos, so if you enjoyed them, please don't hesitate to donate. Thank you.